The Los Angeles Clippers missed out on the playoffs thanks to an entire missed season from Kawhi Leonard and only 31 games from Paul George. But with their stars back healthy, surrounded by arguably the best depth in the NBA and one of the best coaches in the association, here is why the LA Clippers are NBA title contenders. Everything for the Clippers starts with the health of their stars. It goes without saying that if Kawhi Leonard and Paul George can't stay healthy, the Clippers are not title contenders. But if they are, well then they are amongst the best in the NBA. Kawhi Leonard returns from a torn ACL after missing the entire 2021-22 season, but with over 12 months of rehab, should be in a great place to have a great impact for this upcoming season. As typical with Kawhi, expect some minutes restrictions early on whenever he does return, some load management, no back-to-back games being played throughout the first couple of months of his season. But the point is, as long as you get him through to the playoffs, you know he's going to be one of the best players in the league. This guy doesn't pick up minor injuries. He plays, he competes, he plays hard, and nearly every playoff run he has, he ends up making people consider him one of the best, if not the greatest player currently in the league, and that alone is the biggest reason why the Clippers are NBA title contenders. If you can get him past the major injury hurdles, he is ready to go otherwise. As much as people give Kawhi this injury-prone label, yeah, he has had some significant injuries, but he doesn't pick up these 2, 3, 4-week injuries. If he can get over the torn ACL, he's going to be good to go, and he's going to be one of the best players in the league. Paul George himself is a pretty darn nice number 2 option. Before he went out due to injury last season, he was finally reminding people how good of a player he is. Finally shut up Twitter. And he was putting himself in legit MVP conversations. And he's going to be a number 2, arguably the best number 2 in the league. Paul George is not the ideal number 1 option on a contender, but as a secondary option is brilliant. He's one of the best 3-point shooters in the NBA, a very good defender, and a good playmaker. He does a little bit of everything, while being amongst the best scorers in the league, and having that alongside Kawhi Leonard is a pretty nice luxury to have. And of course, these two stars are what gives this team a chance of being title contenders. As we saw last season, this team is fine without their stars, but they're nowhere near a team at the top of the league. However, when you compare this team to other teams across the NBA that have multiple stars, their depth, in terms of quantity and quality, is what really stands out. They have a ton of guys who can shoot. They have multiple players who can give you 15 to 20 plus on any given night who are not Kawhi or Paul George. They have a team full of good to great defenders, and that's all speared by an amazing head coach. So let's talk about that depth and why it separates them as title contenders for next season. Let's start with trade deadline acquisition Norman Powell. Norm has proven in the right situation he can be a 20-point per game scorer in the NBA. He can create his own shot. He is a very good 3-point shooter off of the dribble or in catch-and-shoot situations. He attacks the rim with great aggression and ultimately is a very aggressive scorer, is quite efficient, and can play multiple roles within an offense. He has shown he can be the main guy on the ball as he runs a second unit, or he can fit into a starting lineup as a secondary shot creator while being a great floor spacer and 3-point shooter. Having a guard who can put up 20 plus on any given night alongside Kawhi and PG is a luxury. Powell often goes under the radar, but don't get it twisted. He is a very productive and valuable player and will serve as a great addition to this Clippers team, whether starting at the 2 or whilst being the lead scorer off the bench, which is wild that a 20-point per game scorer who isn't a complete liability on defense could be coming off the bench for this team. It remains unsure where he will fit into the rotation, but I do personally expect him to come off the bench. Although either way, he's probably going to close out a lot of games, he's going to see minutes alongside Kawhi and Paul George, and he is going to be a very valuable member of this team. But the reality is that the fact that we're even here talking about the possibility of Powell coming off of the bench speaks to the depth of this Clippers roster. Nicolas Batum has gone from being paid like an all-star in Charlotte to being released and now returning to role player pay in a great role player role with the Clippers. Batum has started the majority of his games since joining the Clippers, and he has been a great fit in that starting lineup. He is a 40% 3-point shooter, ensuring a great, reliable shooter around Kawhi and Paul George. He has been a very good wing defender throughout his time in LA, which alongside Kawhi, PG, Reggie, and the many other good defenders on this team helps form a great team defense, while also providing some secondary creation and playmaking at times. Batum is a great modern-day wing role player and will continue to be that for the Clippers this season, whether it be in the starting lineup or on the bench. John Wall, of course, has been added to this roster over the course of the offseason, and I don't really have much to say here because I don't know what to expect. John Wall has played 40 games over the last 3 seasons, 113 games over the last 5, and he last played in the NBA on April 4th, 2021. In a season where he played on a bad team, put up the worst efficiency of his career, and as expected did not display the same level of elite athleticism that was displayed during his time in Washington. How good will John Wall be? Well, that remains to be seen, but despite his injuries, he is still only 32 heading into next season and no longer has to be the elite level all-star he once was. However, if he can provide some rim pressure and playmaking, creating some more offense for Paul George and Kawhi, he can be valuable to this roster. And it is also worth remembering that John Wall was once one of the best perimeter defenders in the league, and if we can at least still see some level of that heading into next season, then he's just going to be another great contributor to a very good Clippers defense. His lack of three-point shooting and spacing could be a problem around Kawhi and Paul George, and so it'll be interesting to see how that leads to his contribution in closing lineups and whether Reggie Jackson or Norman Powell get ruled in favor for him in closing games. But that remains to be seen, as pretty much everything does with John Wall heading into next season. Reggie Jackson will be the other guard fighting for that starting spot after being asked to do a lot for this Clippers team offensively since the injury of Kawhi Leonard. He did struggle for efficiency last season, but was the lead offensive option at times last season for this roster, something that is not likely to be the case this season with Kawhi, Paul George, and Norm all at the very least having bigger scoring roles than he will, which should see him improve his efficiency again and continue to be a very valuable rotational guard. Reggie Jackson was one of the worst mid-range shooters in the league last year, but that shouldn't have to be something he has to rely on as much this season, which should significantly improve his efficiency. Either way, this is a guy who has started 78% of his games since joining the Clippers, and yet could be coming off of the bench full-time next year, which is a pretty darn nice luxury to have. Marcus Morris will likely see himself coming off of the bench for the first time since he has joined the LA Clippers roster as well, which again, just speaks to the depth of this Clippers team. Morris has started 61% of his games throughout his NBA career and has started 78% of his games since joining the Clippers, but will now be a full-time bench player, allowing him to use a bit more of his offensive creation skills, still be a solid three-point shooter, and continue to provide some good bench scoring. Luke Kennard knows how to hit the three ball. As a starter or off of the bench, that's his job, and he knows how to do it quite well. He is limited in the rest of his game, but he allows the rest of the team to have more space to operate while knocking down threes. Robert Covington certainly is not as good as he was a few years ago in Minnesota or in Houston, but saying you get to have the 3-and-D wing Robert Covington come off of your bench is a very healthy sign for your wing depth, and as we all know, you can never have enough 3-and-D wings, specifically in the playoffs. He is still an impactful team defender, and although he has shown some inconsistencies from threes over the last year or two, he is still solid from that area. Terence Mann continues to be a high-level role player, another good 3-and-D wing. The Clippers have plenty of those, and that is going to bode very well for them moving forward. Mann competes well on the defensive end and has improved his three-point shooting since joining the league. Add that to his ability to attack the rim, and Mann is a fun role player who has been and will continue to be a valuable rotational wing for the Clippers. Amir Coffey is another great Clipper scouting find who had a very good third season in the league. He may find his way out of the rotation in this very deep team, but this is the 12th man, most likely, in this rotation, which just speaks to the absurd quantity of depth on this team. That is not to mention Brandon Boston Jr., who showed some scoring flashes in year one, and Moses Brown, who could provide some depth behind Zubac if the Clippers do decide to play with a true 5 off the bench. If the Clippers starting lineup is John Wall, Norman Powell, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and Ivan Zubac, which was voted on by you guys, the community, as the most likely starting lineup next season for the Clippers, then their core bench pieces are Reggie Jackson, Nick Batum, Luke Kennard, Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, and Terence Mann. These 6 bench players have started 60% of their games over the last 2 seasons, and yet they are all going to be coming off of the bench full-time next season, according to the community, which is absolutely absurd in terms of quantity and quality off of the bench. Remember, around Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. This bench and the depth pieces in general on the roster are amongst the best we have ever seen in recent memory, and when paired with a superstar, a perennial all-star, a great team defense, and one of the best head coaches in the NBA, you are set for one of the best teams in the NBA, and in turn a team everyone should fear as an NBA title contender. The Clippers have 11 very good rotational players, not to mention Amir Johnson amongst others. As a unit, they can defend very well, they can shoot the 3-ball well, and it allows for their stars to have a supporting cast that they can rely on, and not to only have a supporting cast that they have to carry. It allows them to mix and match matchups and rotations depending on the opponent, and specifically during the regular season allows Kawhi and PG to take some nights off, have some rest, have some stretches in games where they don't have to carry on offense without the team suffering dramatically. Health is the key part of this aging Clippers roster, who have seen their stars in and out of the lineup over the last few seasons. But if this team stays healthy, they have the star power, they have the depth, they have the coaching, and they have the defense to beat anybody in the NBA and win an NBA title.